Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm delighted to host our conversation this evening with Walter Isaacson. But first, an overview of tonight's program. We'll begin with remarks by Mr. Isaacson, followed by my conversation with him about his most recent book, The Innovators. So now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our featured guest. Walter Isaacson is president and CEO of the Aspen Institute, which is a nonpartisan educational and policy studies organization based in Washington, D.C. He's worked as a political correspondent, national editor, editor of new media, before becoming Time magazine's 14th editor in 1996. He became chairman and CEO of CNN, and then president of CEO of the Aspen Institute in 2003. He's the author of Steve Jobs, Einstein, His Life and Universe, Benjamin Franklin, An American Life, Kissinger, A Biography, and he's also the co-author of The Wise Men, Six Friends, and the World They Made. Mr. Isaacson is Chair Emeritus of Teach for America, which recruits recent college graduates to teach in underserved communities, and he was appointed by President Barack Obama to serve as the chairman of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which oversees Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and other international broadcasts of the United States. Mr. Isaacson's most recent book, The Innovators, How a Group of Inventors, Hackers, Geniuses, and Geeks Created the Digital Revolution, is a biological tale of people who invented the computer, the microprocessor, the internet, and some of the greatest innovations of our time. He's a graduate of Harvard College. He's a Rhodes Scholar and a board director of some of America's most distinguished institutions, including Harvard, United Airlines, and Tulane University in his native New Orleans. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome one of the world's most extraordinary chroniclers of innovation, Walter Isaacson.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Salim, for having me. Thank you very much, Earl, for that kind introduction. It's great to be here, especially at an urban innovation center. One of the things that surprises me as I travel around over the past 10 years is the growth of these urban innovation centers. Obviously, this is both the largest and most exciting that I've seen. But we thought that the digital revolution would allow us all to sort of telecommute, Skype, do Google Hangouts. But what we didn't realize is that creative people do like to gather together. They do like to rub elbows. They do like to meet in the flesh. That's why Marissa Mayer, when she took over Yahoo, she said, hey, quit telecommuting in, show up at the office. Real creativity happens in person. It's also why Steve Jobs, when he built the Pixar headquarters and designed the new Apple headquarters in Cupertino, just made this big old atrium where you have to go through it, bump into people, whether you're going to the bathroom, the screening room, or get something to eat. Because he said when people meet face to face, the sparks fly, ideas happen. And I especially like to see it here in beautiful Toronto, how that innovation is happening in a real space. My hometown in New Orleans, we're trying to build a few things like this, and I will go back to New Orleans next week with a whole lot of ideas in my head. Innovation is an interesting word for a center like this. It's a word that's been used a lot. It's sort of become a buzzword, and I think it's been drained of some of its meaning because we use it so much. So one reason I did this book was to actually look at real innovators, real people who actually had made an advance and made a leap. People say, what's the secrets of innovation? And I say, well, you know, if you want one of those, you can buy one of those little books that says 7 Secrets to Innovation. But really, those of us, it's lucky for those of us who write books and biographies and biographical narratives, because there is no one way to do innovation. You have to look into yourself, say, what talents do I have? What are my creative talents? Is it building teams? Is it working with people? Is it having vision? Is it being an executive, an engineer, or what? And then form a team around you, because that is the main theme of the book, is that creativity is a collaborative process. Innovation's a team sport. And that's true, I found out, even in doing Steve Jobs. I once asked Steve Jobs a few years ago, when he was very sick, I said, what product are you most proud of? I thought maybe you would say the iPod or the iPhone or maybe the original Mac. And he said, no, those products were hard, but what was really hard was creating a team, pulling together a group of people who could collaborate. The best product I ever made was Apple, both in the early 80s when he did the original Mac team with the pirate flag hanging over the Bandar building, or when he did the team he left at Apple. He was a visionary. He was pretty strong and tough to work with. People said, how could he be so mean? How could he be so tough to work with? You have to look at the results. People said he was hard to work with, but I wouldn't have given it up for anything in the world. In fact, all the way through his career, he has the most loyal and dedicated teams of people working with him. So in starting to write about innovators, one of the things I discovered is they do tend to come in teams and come in pairs. I began with Ada Lovelace. Seems like an odd place to begin, the 1830s. The real computer revolution doesn't begin until 100 years later. But Ada Lovelace was Lord Byron's daughter. And what I did is I tried to find just real people, and I'm going to just pick a few of them and then we'll get into our conversation, but real people who excited me. So Ada Byron, the Countess of Lovelace. Her father, of course, is a great romantic poet. If you know anything about Lord Byron, it will not surprise you to learn that by the time Ada was growing up, Lady Byron was not that fond of Lord Byron. In fact, he was too much of a romantic poet. And she decided to make sure that Ada would not succumb to that fate by having Ada tutored mainly in mathematics, as if mathematics were some antidote to being romantic or a poet. It didn't quite work. Ada ended up loving math and loving poetry. She called it poetical science, and she's able to do what all great innovators do, which is connect the arts to the sciences. To go back to Steve Jobs once again, any of you have seen on YouTube any of his product launches, the big slide on the screen at the very end is the intersection of two streets, the arts and the sciences. He says that's where the true creativity happens. And that was true of Ada Lovelace. She traveled around the English Midlands looking at the looms, the mechanical looms, weaving machines that were using punch cards to do these beautiful tapestries. Her father was a Luddite, and I mean that literally. Lord Byron's only speech in the House of Lords was defending Ned Ludd and his followers who were smashing these looms because they thought technology put people out of work. Wrong. Ada got the beauty of it. She said, oh, those punch cards can do beautiful tapestries. She had a friend named Charles Babbage. They were the team there. That friend, Charles Babbage, is making a numerical calculator. And Ada says, if you use the punch cards he's thinking of using, it can do more than just numbers. It can do patterns. It can do art. It can do music. It can do anything that can be noted in symbols, words, anything. In other words, she envisions the computer as opposed to just the calculator. She even writes an algorithm and publishes it, back when women didn't generally publish scientific papers, in a scientific journal, describing the analytical engine, but even laying out how you would instruct it to do something, a particular task. So she really is the first published software programmer and really a pioneer in software programming. You leap forward 100 years, and you get to somebody else who's interesting. You'll hear more about him soon because the movie's coming out in a couple of weeks called The Imitation Game, but it's Alan Turing. And he read and based a lot of what he did on Ada Lovelace. But there was one thing about Ada Lovelace that he disagreed with, because Ada said a machine will be able to do everything. And then she adds her caveat, except think. The machines will not be imaginative. They won't be creative. That's where you have to connect humans to machine and connect them as closely as possible. Turing says, that's Lady Lovelace's objection, he called it. And he says, how do we know that? How would we test that? And he comes up with what is called the imitation game. We now call it the Turing test. You put a machine and a person in a room, you send in questions, and after a while you cannot tell which one's a machine and which one's a human. He says there's no reason to say the machine isn't thinking. The beginning of artificial intelligence research under Turing. Now, my book, I kept waiting for artificial intelligence to happen, but it doesn't. Year after year, people say it's 20 years away. And now you'll have people on the stage who'll come here and say it's 20 years away. But we don't actually get that much closer to artificial intelligence. What we do get closer to and see in leaps and bounds is innovation that comes from the intimate connection of humans to machines. You know, next time I'm here, I'll be wearing an Apple Watch, wearing Google Glass, having the iPhone as well as my BlackBerry in the pocket. And yes, I am still a BlackBerry person, even though I have an iPhone and a BlackBerry because I'm really geeky and can't make up my mind. Because of this, our machines are becoming more attached to us and more intimate. And that sort of refutes, in a way, Alan Turing's belief that we would not be able to tell machines from humans. Alan Turing, as you probably know, is homosexual, not totally open about it, but not ashamed of it. But being in British intelligence, breaking the German wartime codes in World War II, and then afterwards, it was not a hospitable time for that to happen. So he got arrested for his homosexuality. And he is sentenced to take hormone treatments, as if he's a machine, as if you can reprogram him by giving him hormone treatments. He does it for a while, seems to take it in stride, but then, tragically, he takes an apple, dips it in cyanide, bites into the apple, and kills himself. Is that something a machine would do? I don't think so. And in some ways, Alan Turing's own life is a living refutation, in a way, of the difference between humanity and the complexity of it and machines that are totally pre-programmed. Anyway, throughout the digital age, you see this notion of trying to make our machines more personal and more intimate with us. One of the other heroes in the book is a guy named J.C.R. Licklider. Hardly ever heard of him. But he developed the air defense system. He was at MIT. And he realized that if you have an air defense system, you really have to have easy, interactive computers. You can't do, none of you are old enough to remember, but I am. You are, because you were there with me in college, carrying batch processing punch cards we coded in Fortran. And you'd bring them to the computer as if you were bringing an offering to an oracle, and there'd be priests around the damn computer, and they would take your punch cards, and if you dropped them, you were toast or whatever. He said, no, it has to be interactive, fast, intimate, right? Partnership, symbiosis with humans. He does that. He also makes graphical user interfaces because you got to be able to see the missiles coming in the plane, see which one's moving, how fast they're going, all very graphically. And he even says we have to network all these things, and he jokingly calls it the Intergalactic Computer Network. But when he gets to the Pentagon, he funds it. It becomes ARPANET, then the Internet. So all these things come from these types of heroes we don't fully know. They also tend to come in teams. When they do the ARPANET, the people who were doing it were the main research centers in universities like UCLA, SRI, that had gotten these machines, but there was no way to figure out the protocols for communicating. So being research centers, they did what most research centers do, is they delegated this task to their graduate students. So a bunch of graduate students, led by Steve Crocker, said, okay, we're going to do it, and we're going to make it very collaborative. We're going to do it as a team. And he even came up with a name for the proposals they were going to do, like how you do address headers, how you figure out how to break up packets and make sure they reignite at the end of a, sort of scurrying through the web. And he called it requests for comments because it sounded inviting, as if you brought people in instead of saying, here's the protocol or here's the way we're going to do it. And so the internet is imbued with the genetic code of collaboration, and some really cool people you probably never heard of who actually created those internet protocols. The other thing that shows me the importance of collaboration is the invention of the computer. Now, the internet and the computer are the two most important inventions of our age, right? And basically, we don't know who invented them, leaving aside Al Gore jokes. And so you take the computer. There's one, of course, that's Colossus, which is the machine at Bletchley, England, that Alan Turing helped build with Tommy Flowers and the whole team that helps break the German code. But to me, a computer has to be able to do more than one thing. It has to be programmable. It can't just be for a special purpose. It's got to be a general purpose machine like Ada Lovelace envisioned. So I don't really think Colossus qualifies as the original computer. You have, in the United States, two possible contenders. One, in Iowa State, there's a guy named John Atanasoff who sort of looks at tubes and everything else and figures out how to do a logical circuit with tubes and pretty much gets it working a bit, the circuit, but he can't get the whole thing built. The punch card burner doesn't work. Other mechanical things don't work. Why? Because he's doing it as a loner, just as a graduate student working for him, has no team, has no mechanics. So when he goes off in the Navy in World War II, they don't even know what this contraption is in the basement at Iowa State, and they just dismantle it and throw it away. It would have been totally lost to history, except for somebody else who's really cool and just the opposite. Loves to pick up ideas and make teams. The importance of teamwork was ingrained in John Mauchly's soul. He traveled all over the country from the 1939 World's Fair to Bell Labs to Harvard, where Grace Hopper and Howard Aiken were doing the Mark I computer. And even hears about this dude in Iowa, and he drives 4 days with his kid in a car. John Mauchly does to find this guy in Iowa, look at his machine, pick up ideas. It became a 15-year intellectual property patent dispute. But let's leave the lawyers aside. What happens is he goes back to Penn. He says, oh, I picked up these ideas like a bumblebee cross-pollinating things. This is how innovation occurs. This is why you need buildings like this. And what he does is he says, I need a great engineer. He gets Presper Eckert. He says, I need really smart mathematicians who can reprogram this machine so it can be general purpose. And he picked 6 women mathematicians. Back then, women were at the forefront of math. There were 6 brilliant, not very well-known women. I was really excited to discover them because I don't think women have enough role models in the history of technology. They weren't very famous because they had to do it secretly. It was World War II. So they're secretly figuring out ways to reprogram ENIAC, which is the computer that they're building, so that it doesn't just do ballistic missile trajectories, it does atom bomb explosion calculations, sonic booms, everything else that they may need after the war is done. I will say that they've been written out of history, but they weren't appreciated that much at the time either. There's a wonderful Valentine's Day in 1946, February, where they unveil ENIAC. It's been kept secret during the war. Front page of the New York Times. They have a huge unveiling, and the 6 women of ENIAC, led by Jean Jennings, do a great demonstration test of how a missile would go, exactly how it's calculated, everything else. The blinking lights looking just like we later saw in the movies. And at the end, it's just a grand demonstration. Makes the front page of most of the papers, including the New York Times. And they have a candlelit dinner at the University of Pennsylvania in the great old hall there, in which they invite all sorts of people from Washington, political leaders, generals. But the 6 women who did the programming weren't invited. They took the bus back to their apartments in Philadelphia. And it was sort of because I think men did not appreciate a couple things. First of all, they didn't appreciate women engineers. Secondly, they did not appreciate programming. They thought, being boys with their toys, that the hardware was the most important thing. They didn't realize that the hardware becomes somewhat interchangeable. After a while, you don't care whether you're using a Sperry Rand or a UNIVAC or a Honeywell or a DEC or a IBM mainframe. What matters is the software programming. These women who partner with Grace Hopper at Harvard, they do it collaboratively, create all sorts of programming languages such as COBOL that work across hardware platforms, and they really become the pioneer programmers of the age. Over and over again, you see collaboration and the joining of human creativity to computing, winning out and creating things. For example, these computers were really large. You couldn't really own them. They weren't personal. They were owned by corporations and the Pentagon and the government. But there was a yearning, especially in California in the early 1970s, to make it more personal, make it more intimate, just like Ada Lovelace said they should be. These were a whole different types of people. There were the hippies, the hackers, the phone freakers, the wireheads, the people who were part of the free speech movement at Berkeley, the people who were doing the electric Kool-Aid acid test, the people going to communes who were reading the Whole Earth catalog once too often. But all those tribes met at places like the Homebrew Computer Club in Palo Alto, and they had one thing in common, which is a resistance to authority. They didn't like authority. They didn't like the power being controlled by central authority. They wanted computing power to the people. They were rebellious. And so what they do is find ways to hack into the idea of a computer and make it smaller and more personal. The hobbyists in particular, a guy named Ed Roberts, creates the first Altair, looking at the Intel 8088 microprocessor, says, I can make this into a computer that real people could just take home. Now, if you've ever seen the Altair, and I remember when it was on the cover of Popular Electronics, it stinks. I mean, it doesn't do anything. It just has a whole row of lights on the front. You do a lot of toggle switches, right? And the lights go on and off. You can add and subtract a few things. It's not a very useful machine. But there it is in the January 74 issue of Popular Electronics on the cover. I was in college at the time. It comes out in December 73. Unfortunately, I was not friends in college with some other people who were taking the same computer science course I was. They were a little bit better than me. Because a guy named Paul Allen has been convinced by his friend Bill Gates to drop out of the University of Washington. Paul Allen is there walking through Harvard Square, sees at the out-of-town news, right in the middle of Harvard Square, there's Popular Electronics with the Altair on it, plunks down 75 cents, trots to the Courier House dorm room of Bill Gates and says, this is happening without us. It's exam period. Gates is supposed to be doing it. He blows off all 4 of his exams, and for 7 weeks straight, using the computer in the Science Center, funded by the Defense Department, they code BASIC for the Altair. Another thing happens is they bring, and so the BASIC for the Altair, they drop out of college, and they start doing business as Micro-Soft. They also put this computer on the road. They take it to the Homebrew Computer Club in 74. And a guy named Steve Wozniak is there. He thinks it's a pretty stinky machine, but he looks at the specs for the microprocessor and says, I can make a better one. So he goes home and he sketches out a way to make a computer that connects to a monitor and a keyboard. And at the next homebrew meeting, people steal copies of Bill Gates' Microsoft BASIC and share it. 70 copies are made of the tape to give away for free. So it's a first clash between free and open source software versus Microsoft's proprietary model. Another thing happens, also a clash between 2 people who are friends. Woz starts handing out for free to everybody in the homebrew his diagrams and specs for creating a better personal computer. He has his friend from down the street, Steve Jobs, carrying the TV set so that they can hook it up to the TV set and show it off. But Steve Jobs says to Woz, why are we giving this away for free? We could go to my parents' garage and make these things and sell them and make money. So just out of that little thing, you see Microsoft and the formation of Apple. And both of them are done by partners, a visionary and somebody who can execute, forming a team around them. I'll end by saying you see it over and over again. Not the quest for the lone inventor in the garret or garage having a light bulb moment and creating artificial intelligence, but people who collaborate to make our machines collaborate with us. That's been the narrative of the digital age. People say to me, well, what about Google? Isn't Google close to artificial intelligence? Can it answer most questions? First of all, no. You could ask Google a really tough question like, what's the depth of the Red Sea? And instantly it'll tell you whatever it is, 5,748 feet, something your smartest friends don't know. But ask it a simple question like, can a crocodile play basketball? And it'll have no clue, even though a 4-year-old could tell you after a bit of giggling. Over and over again, you see that human minds are much different from machines, and that the quest to make our machines replace our human minds is not only futile, but silly and unnecessary. Instead, the Ada Lovelace, Alan Kay, Steve Jobs, Doug Engelbart, JCR Licklider quest to make them more partners and connect is a better way. In fact, it's even the way that Larry Page and Sergey Brin did it when they did Google. People think Google goes out and somehow or another figures all these things out or goes out into the web as a crawler and comes up with these answers. No. All Google does is look at the millions of judgments made each day by people who build web pages, the judgments they make when they put a link, and it harvests human judgments. It's the ultimate combination of human judgments and machine power. And that gets back to Ada, which is the importance of connecting the humanities to technology, because that's at the core of connecting humans to machines. The people who can stand in both camps, like Ada did, like Steve Jobs did, like almost everybody in this book. They all love music, they all love art, and they're also engineers. They'll be really the leaders of the next wave of the revolution, when it's not just about engineering, but about doing what you're doing in this building, which is connecting the creative industries to technology. That really demands, in our education system, that we not only emphasize the science, technology, engineering, and math that's become so fashionable these days, but also things like the humanities and the arts, so the creativity can be a part of this revolution, because it's the creative people who will survive. It's also the people who understand the humanities, who understand history, who are going to have the moral judgments that are going to be so necessary, so we stay one step ahead of our technology, whether it comes to NSA spying or singularities or anything else technology can do. We have to be educated enough to provide the creativity and the moral judgment that comes from it. But the reverse is also true, because sometimes when I give a talk and I talk about the importance of the humanities, I get a whole bunch of nods from people who are humanists, people who love the arts. But people who are humanists and love the arts, including myself, and this is the real reason I wrote the book too, they should also appreciate engineering and math, just like Ada did, because she knew that a mathematical equation or an algorithm was just a beautiful brushstroke that painted something awesome in the universe, and that you should visualize it, just like you could visualize some of her dad's poetry. She walks in beauty like the night, the wine dark sea, whatever it may be, you picture it. Ada could do that with engineering and math. And so those who love the humanities and the arts should actually wrestle a little bit. I don't make you wrestle too hard in the book, but just a little bit with what the surface state of a semiconductor is, how the electrons dance, what quantum theory tells you about how to make them dance differently, how you can dope the silicon to make it sort of like an on-off switch, how it becomes a transistor, how you etch that onto big pieces of chips of silicon to make a microchip. All that might not seem as beautiful as Lord Byron's poetry, but trust me, it is. And all of it is there from the human imagination and the human creativity that I tried to celebrate in this book, and y'all are celebrating here. Thank you all very much. Earl? Great. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Just a few questions, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience. It's clear that one of the objectives of your book was to help us to reassess how innovation really happens. Why is that so important to you?
I think that a couple of things. First of all, if we get alienated or detached from our technology, I meet so many people who say to me, "Oh, I have no idea what a transistor is. I can't, I can't do it. I don't understand it." And it used to be when I was growing up, it was easier. As I said, I did Heathkits, I did ham radios. I tested tubes. You don't remember what a vacuum tube is, but you'd had them in our radios. They'd burn out. You'd test them and you buy new ones. I sorted transistors from resistors and, made circuits. And I wasn't a huge electronics. I was just a normal kid, a geeky kid growing up in New Orleans. But I had a sense of what an on-off switch, how that works in a circuit, and what a logic gate is, either or, and or, that sort of switches you could do. That's every single thing you have, from your iPhone and BlackBerry to your computer. That's how it works. I think if we get alienated and detached from our technology, A, it's not healthy for us as a citizenry because, we shouldn't fear technology. We should embrace it like we do poetry. It's also not good for our souls. We really should understand our devices. That's what makes us human, is that we create tools and technology and innovation, and we understand it. Other species don't do that. It's basic part of our human nature.
So what makes us truly human is to be able to create tools to make our lives easier, but at the same time to appreciate the essence of our humanity in some ways.
Yeah, I think that if you don't if somehow you don't appreciate your tools, it was something Stuart Brand, who many of you may have heard of, ran the Whole Earth catalog, did the mother of all demos that shows off Engelbart's very graphical network computers, helped do the lights for the electric Kool-Aid acid test when Ken Kesey was teaching everybody how to drop acid. And he really did feel, and that was the Whole Earth catalog mentality, that if we let other people control our tools, that's what creates the Orwellian world instead of the world we want to live in.
Mm-hmm. You've written a book about Einstein, and early on in the Innovators, you quote him, and he talks about intuition as really being the outcome of earlier intellectual experiences that the innovators had. In other words, innovators stand on the shoulders of people who came before them. Can you say a little bit more about that, perhaps looking at the development of the computer, what happened at Bell Labs or the ARPANET?
Well, a couple of things. First, about intuition. Steve Jobs was the greatest intuitive genius. He was not as smart in terms of pure mental processing power as, say, Bill Gates, but he had an intuitive sense. Where did that intuitive sense come from? It came from a whole lot of experience, from dropping out to going to an ashram in India, to dropping acid, to working at Atari, to doing calligraphy and dance classes, as well as studying electronics. And all of that becomes part of a stew, out of which his intuition, so that when he makes an MP3 music player, it's the iPod, and when Bill Gates makes it, it's called the Zune, and you don't even remember what it looks like, because it looks like it was made in Kazakhstan by slave labor or something. And as Steve once said of Bill Gates, he would have been a more intuitive person with more taste had he at least dropped acid once or gone to an ashram in India. I don't necessarily recommend that as the main experience that you should have, but intuition comes from a variety of places. So to take some specific examples, I mentioned Grace Hopper and Howard Aiken rather briefly. They're the ones who do the computer at Harvard. Just like Alan Turing had read Ada Lovelace and Babbage, so had they 100 years later. And they even found a part of Babbage's difference engine, which was in an attic in a science building at Harvard. And they look at it, they incorporate it, they put it on the face of the computer they're doing. And in the manual, they start with Ada Lovelace's insights on the analytical engine. I think we all build upon the insights that are handed down to us. You say Bell Labs. Yeah, I mean, at Bell Labs, it was partly true because the intuition came from combining lots of people. As I said, with ENIAC, you needed the engineers, the visionaries. At Bell Labs, you had Claude Shannon, this awesome guy juggling balls on a unicycle up and down the corridors, and he's into information theory. He understands what on-off switches, how you can do all of Boolean algebra, all of logic, just with yes-no questions, right? You also have, as I said, Bardeen, who is a theorist who can envision the way electrons dance on the semiconductor's surface, and Walter Bratton, who knew how to put a paperclip in and break it and figure out how to, manipulate it and stuff. You also had people who climbed telephone poles and had grease under their fingernails because they wanted to amplify phone signals. All these people are bouncing around in Bell Labs, and in that stew comes the intuition of how you get away from the clunky old vacuum tube and create transistors that'll do the same thing.
I couldn't help but being struck when I read the book about this sort of enormous expressive and creative energy that seemed to exist in the United States throughout this period of the digital revolution, whether it was New York or Boston and particularly California. And so I'm thinking, as a Canadian, what was happening particularly in California at that time? I mean, you were talking about Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters and the Grateful Dead, as well as a lot of people who were engineering geniuses.
I think I attributed all to the Grateful Dead. John Weir's lyrics, become... Sure. Now, I do a whole chapter on what was it in that cultural stew there. And part of it was because it was the late 60s, early 70s. People were avoiding the Vietnam War. People were starting the protest and free speech movements. The notion of deferring to authority has become shall we say, cast away. The acid trips are not just there for the acid, but for the whole rebellious nature of it all. And so a lot of things come out of that. Number one is a willingness to take risks. Number two is having no fear of failure. Number three is questioning authority and questioning all received wisdom. So how does that enter into innovation? Well, all those are ingredients for innovation. I mean, that can happen anywhere, but I do think that cultural stew in the Bay Area of California in the late 60s and early 70s, and you add to that a lot of electronics people, because all the defense end, Westinghouse and I think Rockwell or all these places are out there, and their kids, the dads are wearing pocket protectors and using slide rules, but the kids are becoming phone freakers and hacking into the Bell system. And I think there was that perfect mix. But it takes bringing people together, and I'll give one more shout out to your center. I'm sure you have a whole clash of diverse backgrounds, ideas, talents, outlooks, and when they come together here, it's better than everybody working in their garage or garret.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to just talk a little bit about where innovation is going, because it seems to me there are two approaches, which one you refer to in your book is what you call the sort of military, industrial, academic triangle, where you have very large institutions working together, some cases to protect and defend the United States. In other cases, you've got hacker culture. You've got people who are really not bound by institutional rules, who want to share IP, who want to crowdsource money and ideas. Where are we headed? Because these seem to be really divergent directions.
But they're not. What's wonderful is when they clash and come together. And just take the internet, for example. I told you about Steve Crocker and others doing the protocols. This is funded by the Pentagon. The reason the Pentagon is funding this is they want to decentralize, in fact, distributed, totally decentralized communication system where there's no central hub, not even regional hubs that the Soviets can bomb. They want it to survive a nuclear attack. And so they're looking for the most survival, and they get to the notion of packet switching, which has been developed at RAND by Paul Barron, who was trying to do it for this very reason, to survive a nuclear attack. But you delegate it to all these graduate students who are just like you say. They don't care about the Pentagon. They don't love the military complex. They don't want power to be centralized there. They're kind of the resistors. And yet they're the ones doing the protocols. And they're doing it in some ways with the same architecture, but to keep it from being centrally controlled. They want to distribute the power to every node, so there's no on-off switch, nobody can own or run the internet. So there's been this great debate over the years. Was the internet created to survive a nuclear attack, or is that just an urban myth? In fact, at Time magazine, we once said, internet, it was created to survive a nuclear attack. And Steve Crocker wrote us a letter, this guy I told you about, the graduate student who did the protocols at the very beginning with Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn and others. Said, no, you got it all wrong. And so Time wrote back saying, no, we have better sources than you, which typical Time arrogance. So I looked into it for this book. And the guy who was Time source, because having worked at Time magazine, I can get all the files and figure out who the sources were. There's a guy named Stephen Lukasich. He actually ran ARPA, the Pentagon's Advanced Research Project. He's getting the money. And so he says to me, Steve Crocker didn't know what he was talking about. I was on top, and he was on the bottom. So he had no idea what was going on. So then I asked Crocker this. He says, no, Lukasich doesn't know what was going on. I was on the bottom, and he was on the top. So he had no clue of what was going on. And that's how these sort of cultures can create, without getting too Hegelian on us, a sort of a symbiosis, a synthesis, that from clashing cultures, you create something.
So it's somewhat ironic that the military, who wanted to control and protect through a distributed system of communication, ultimately created, in part, the internet, which is probably, in some ways, creates greater independence, greater freedom for people who can access it independently.
Yes, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing for the United States and Canada. It's a good thing for societies that are comfortable with the free flow of information, that are comfortable with people having different ideas and getting to express them and not having to go through gatekeepers or censors or people who control the switches and hubs to be able to get their ideas out. And there are two types of countries in this world. Those like Canada and the United States, where for all of the messiness, we kind of like the fact that people can bloviate in the blogosphere and tweet in the Twittersphere and say whatever they want. And in that clash of ideas and the free flow of information, we have a democracy. The United States is comfortable with that since before we were the United States, since we were still part of Canada. And Thomas Paine was handing out leaflets on the streets of Philadelphia. Free flow of ideas. If I go to China, if I go to the Middle East, people aren't quite as comfortable with the free flow of ideas. So every now and then you probably get somebody in the upper echelons of the Pentagon or the power structure who wish they could shut down a Snowden or shut down a Greenwald. But you know, I can't remember, it was former head of the NSA, blanking on his name, but a good guy, good gentleman, was on talking about this, said, yeah, at the NSA, we kind of wanted to shut them down. But we also knew we were protecting a society where people like that had freedom. Mm-hmm. And I don't want them to go to jail. I don't want it was James Risen, the reporter who had reported on something, said, I didn't like when he exposed all that stuff, but I'm defending his right to do so. Let's not send him to jail. So we wrestle with it, and even the heads of the NSA and the Pentagon wrestle with it. But we are societies that are pretty glad it turned out that way instead of the other way.
Yeah, some unintended consequences that we're probably pretty grateful for.
We're 99% grateful for them.
One last question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. You know, the book begins and ends with Ada Lovelace. And throughout the book, you highlighted the contributions of women, like Grace Hopper and Jean Jennings, and particularly their contribution to programming and software development. But almost the overarching principle is the link between the technical and the creative, what you called the poetry. And I wanted you to maybe say a little bit about what kind of lessons this has for today's women and how they might think about their role as innovators.
Well, first of all, they don't have enough role models. And they should, which is why I wrote a lot about the women in this book. My daughter first really turned me on to Ada Lovelace when she was a young kid, like 15, 16 years old. And she said, did you know women could code? And I said, well, I guess so, yeah. And she was good in math. In fact, she ended up majoring in computer science at college. And she said, the first time I knew women could be coders and computer science people was when I read a Batman comic. And there was a hero called the Oracle, I think it is, who was a woman who was a coder. She said it was pretty cool to find out that there were actually people like Ada Lovelace who were the pioneers. I think it helps having role models. My dad was an engineer. My uncle were all electrical engineers. I had role models.
All Heathkit builders in the basement?
Yep, and all ham radio operators. And I don't think women have enough role models. Secondly, it's going in the wrong direction. In 1984, 38%, I think, of computer science degrees at American universities went to women. It's now 17%. It's been cut in half. It's going the wrong way. Ouch. So if you're going to have a revolution, it helps to make it inclusive and to have everybody be allowed to be part of the revolution. So that's the advice I'd give women. Also, I'd give them the advice that my daughter said to me, which is girls who code get jobs. Because I do think, and in a serious way, I think that's serious, because I think a company like Google, in which 85% of the engineers there are men, actually don't want to be sexist. If they could, I deeply believe that Larry Page would, love to have more women engineers. And I think there are more women engineers, and I think they will have some more. But I do think that if you're a woman engineer, you're not going to have trouble getting a job at Google. or Facebook, or for Sheryl Sandberg or Marissa Mayer, and now that women, or Megan Smith, who's the Chief Technology Officer of the United States. It's good to have women in power now, and I think that women have too often been told that they're not good in math. This is something women of the 1930s didn't know when there were more women PhDs in math than there were a generation later. The notion, and I must say, I'm going to say something that's not going to be all that popular. A lot of times women and men, but a little bit more often women, come up to me and say, oh, I hate math. I've never been good at math. I say, why are you bragging about it? Why don't you actually put your mind to it? Would you brag about not knowing the difference between Hamlet and Macbeth? Would you brag about, not liking poetry? So you shouldn't be proud of the fact, you shouldn't think people are a Philistine if they don't know the difference between Hamlet and Macbeth, but brag about the fact that you don't know the difference between an integral equation and a differential equation.
Talking about role models, just say a little bit about Grace Hopper. Now, this is a woman who was recruited into the military and retired as the oldest admiral in the history of the United States.
That's because they couldn't let her go because she knew how to reprogram COBOL for them. Grace Hopper, like everybody in my book, is a bit of a rebel. I don't get asked to speak at graduations often because everybody I write about, from Einstein to Ben Franklin to Steve Jobs to Bill Gates to Mark Zuckerberg, they all run away and drop out of college or something, or high school. Grace Hopper did not do that. She got her PhD from Yale, as I said. But when Pearl Harbor happened, she's a professor of math, married, living on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and she says, hell with it. My life's too boring, and she runs away. She divorces her husband, she quits her job, she joins the Navy. That's a pretty cool thing to do. She was then assigned to the Navy computation centers and eventually ends up at Harvard with Howard Aiken. It takes a little bit of guts to do things like that, and she's a role model too, although to the married women in this audience, I don't necessarily think you have to divorce your husband to be cool, but she's somebody who just acted on her passions, which is what being a hacker, geek, or genius requires.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. So let's take some questions from the audience. See the mics there at the table. And sorry, just on the floor there.
Good questions, by the way, Earl.
Oh,
thank you so very much.
All right.
Yeah. I always love innovation centers. You could go to the best university and say, it's time for questions. And all of a sudden, there's dead silence. You go to Innovation Center, people are popping right up. They know that they're cool.
This gentleman over here, could you just say your name and say a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Dan. I went to business school. I currently work in advertising, but I'm also a very avid fan of technology. Thank you for coming. I'm sure by this point in your life, you've heard every single Steve Jobs question imaginable. I just wanted to ask, since writing the book, is there anything that surprised you that you might have missed in writing the book? And then a follow-up question. There was a section of the book where you talk about, there was a moment when Steve Jobs had rethought about this whole idea of the intersection of technologies and the humanities and talked more about how the future is really about biotechnology and such. Have you given that insight any more thought?
Yeah. There's not anything feel that I've now learned about Steve that I wish were in the book. Many times people come up to me and they start by saying, I knew Steve Jobs and I want to tell you. And I think, oh my God, he's going to say, because I portray him as being a somewhat tough character and hard to deal with, but also a genius who then inspires people. And every single story I get was, he was a total jerk to me, he blew me off. He was, to use a technical term they use in Silicon Valley, an asshole. And then they often say something about him being brilliant. So, there's that. There are things I put in that I might have left out that might have been slightly painful to people. There were things I left out because I thought they were just too personally painful. And as a biographer, at a certain point, you have to say, how enlightening is that for the reader versus how painful would that be, like to a family member or a friend or somebody he worked with. So I left some things out. In retrospect, there's probably 5 sentences or 6 I would have left out because I now feel Canadian. I just said out. I got to go back to being in Louisiana. Because I know that they cause people pain. There were things I couldn't get him to talk about enough. I mean, I got him to talk about personal things up the kazoo. He didn't like talking about software design. He just was not a software designer, not a coder. So you talk about hardware design, you try to get him on the Darwin kernel and the next operating system and how that translated to the iOS. And his eyes would glaze over. So I regret, but I'm not sure he really cared about the design of software as much as he should have. On biotech, I think there are a couple of new things, the next phases of the revolution. One, as I said many times in this talk, is connecting the creative industries to technology. The other is saying that innovation isn't just about infotech. It isn't just digital. It's easier to do, if I may say, infotech, information technology, innovation. It can be done in a garage. It can be done with a group of friends. Doing bigger things like Elon Musk is doing with a car, that involves regulation. It involves big, you need, if you're going to build batteries in cars, it's different from doing Facebook in your dorm room with friends. And the second, of course, is biotech. Biotech is the next great frontier, and it will be a different type of innovative frontier. Toronto will be in the center of it because you need great medical research institutions. Boston, Toronto, unlike Silicon Valley, having that concentration. You will not be able to do it quite as much in your dorm room. And it will take a different type of venture capital. It's not like, let's give you $100,000. If you fail, so what? And if you succeed, I own 1% of Facebook and I have $1 billion. It'll be a more capital-intensive thing. But it's actually more important in a way. I don't want to minimize the current phase of the digital revolution, but apps that allow you to rate beers in a bar are not as socially useful as the people at the Broad Institute who are sequencing the genome of viruses, re-engineering it, and will be there the next time we get hit with Ebola.
Let's deal with this question over here.
Yes. So my name is Hamid. I am a co-founder and CEO of Recreate Robotics.
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
I'm a CEO and co-founder of Recreate Robotics. And I enjoy your book. It was very enjoyable to read. And in your book, you touch on, you discuss artificial intelligence, you discuss electronics and computing. So I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on robotics and how the industry you think will evolve. And what do you think would there be need? What do you think is the need that the industry do to actually make it an industry like computing? And a second question, do you have any plans? Is there any plan for like translating the book into other languages so other people?
Well, the easiest one is the second. I think Steve Jobs went to 140 languages, which may have set a record. There are like 17 languages in India alone. This book has been, I think there's 20 languages. I already have the Arabic and the Spanish editions. On robotics, it sort of ties into what I was saying about artificial intelligence, which is we can try to create machines that mimic the human mind or ones that, as Doug Engelbart would say, augment, complement, as Peter Thiel calls it, complementarity. Partnership and symbiosis, the words that Ada Lovelace and Licklider use. I've often felt that the robotics industry was focused too much on trying to replicate humans rather than partner with humans. A robotics industry that does things like in manufacturing and builds things and stuff is great. But I go to, say, Applied Minds, and they're so proud of their robots, and they'll show me a robot that can sort of, almost act like a human. And yet, it still can't walk across a room that's an unfamiliar room, pick up a crayon, and write its name. Just like I said about Google, That's something a 4-year-old can do. So why try to make the robot do in circuitry what we do in analog wetware in our brain? Why not say, let's make it more of the combination, which is, now you can correct me because you're in the field, where the greatest advances seem to have been is in robotics that work with humans instead of try to totally replace them.
I have to say from the stage, I have a bit of a vantage point. And I'm just saying, but this lineup of questionnaires
we're talking about women getting into technology.
Awash in testosterone here.
Yeah. Another reason women don't do well in technology, I hate to say, is Madeleine Albright used to say, women have to learn how to be the first to ask questions and the first to interrupt. So with that, maybe we'll
just leave it at that. Sir.
All right, I'll change the topic then. My name's Peter. I work for a city government, and I have on my floor a number of engineers with public school-aged daughters who definitely have the aptitude for mathematics and engineering, but as you said, not enough role models. I'd love to recommend your book, but if Ada Lovelace of the 19th century and the ENIAC 6 of the 1940s are the only real role models,
and Grace, yeah.
Would you consider doing a sequel to the book in terms of bringing the women up to date in terms of the innovators that are there
Actually,
now?
I'm trying to get my daughter to write some of this too and whatever. I think that there are women role models who aren't things yet for me to do biographies on, like Sheryl Sandberg. But they've written really, really good books, like Lean In. Likewise, Marissa Mayer is a great role model. Megan Smith, who is the chief technology officer. Kara Swisher, who invented or is running Recode. So these are women, most of whom write very well and should be doing more and being out there more. And if I think we went, I can't distort history. The problem is that after the 1940s, when we entered the 1950s, the number of women who did math declined. And from 1984 to the present, the number of women doing computer science declined. So it's a little hard for me to say, let me find the woman role model who started Google. Now, Susan Wojcicki is in the book, she was at Google. But, I don't want to invent history just to make us feel good. Otherwise, that would diminish the women of ENIAC or Grace Hopper or even the women today by pretending that there are more women around than there are at the moment.
Your question, your name, and a little bit about yourself.
Hi, my name's Stavros. I run a 2-person web company. I used to be a journalist. I read the book, and it seems if there's, I don't know, a critique or a discussion to have about it, is that it's very Silicon Valley focused and to a certain extent American focused. Mm-hmm. And now that we do have the internet and the ability, information is diffused, as you discussed, and if you just mentioned right now about medical clusters and so forth, how do you see that shaping up around, I hate the word innovation, but where things are going to be happening and how that's going to work as part of the premise of the book is about that idea of collaboration and the importance of it.
Yeah. I do think it's migrating away from Silicon Valley. You already see that. In fact, the traffic out of San Francisco going to work in the valley, that's where the rush hour is, as opposed to going, because people want to live in cities, they want to live in creative places, they want to be in environments like this one, MaRS. And Steve Case, who was the person who made AOL work, is doing something called The Rise of the Rest, which is about all the cities, Canada and the United States, that aren't Silicon Valley. So I do think with the rise of biotech, with the rise of the creative industry, you'll see the Torontos, the Austins, even the Clevelands becoming innovation centers. Secondly, with biotech, you'll see Cleveland with the Cleveland Clinic, and Boston with the highest concentration of research hospitals, and Toronto being the new centers. The American-centric critique I cop a plea to as being guilty. I tried, just like I tried to find women, I tried to find the great innovations. Now, obviously, there's a lot of Brits in there, so it's Anglo-American centric, meaning everybody from Alan Turing to Tim Berners-Lee are very important. But I tried to find the people in China, the people wherever, who were doing the great innovations. And I'm sure they're there, but I looked at the major innovations of our time. I did not pick the people first. I picked the innovations first, meaning the computer, the transistor, the microchip, the internet, search, the web, those, go through them all. And I don't see the pioneers in other places. I think there are a lot of reasons. One question I get, which is the flip of your question, which is why did it seem, you sort of asked, why did it seem to happen in the San Francisco Bay Area in the early 70s? I think there are a lot of reasons it happens in, I'll say, Canada and the United States, which is, again, our comfort with the free flow of information, our willingness to have societies that allow you to challenge authority. And maybe at some point, things will arise out of China that aren't mainly copies of things that have already happened, elsewhere. And I'm looking for that, but I don't see it in the information technology space in the past 60 years as much. Germany would have been a place. Germany has the early computers with Hermann Zuse and stuff. The problem is, his place got bombed and his computers all got destroyed by the Allied bombing, and Germany was not in as strong of a position for a while.
Hi, Walter. My name is Ryan Collins, and I actually work here at MaRS in a group called Studio Y, which I guess I would describe as a stew of 25 young people from around Ontario. We all come from different backgrounds, like some are artists, I'm an entrepreneur, we have people in biomedicine, biotechnology, engineers, and we try to create change in the world. And I guess my question focuses on how do we create these leaders that you allude to in your book? And my first question would be, you work on a lot of different university boards, college boards, but you mentioned so many people dropping out. So what interventions can universities make to actually create graduates that stick and that are actually being involved in technology? And the second thing would be, you mentioned a lot about intimacy with technology, and then you talk about the stew that Steve Jobs existed in, following his intuition, going to India, working at an apple farm. And for me, I'm challenged to see this a lot in our society today, that we live so dependent and so involved in technology. It's hard for people to sit still and just be comfortable, meditate, sit down. So how do you see universities and different institutions developing people who are proficient in technology, but still have the ability to step away to it and engage in some of the other humanities that are hard to step away from now that we're so intimate with technology?
It's a really good question that we wrestle with at a lot of the universities. And I'll take Stanford and Harvard as slightly differing approaches. Stanford is very successful because it's very utilitarian. It's like, all right, you should be transactional, meaning your studies should be geared to making something. In fact, from the Leland Stanford original, grant to the present, you're supposed to be doing something that will turn into something useful and be transactional. And that's a helpful thing to spur innovation. At Harvard, they're creating both the Innovation Center and the new campuses in Alston that are there to connect with the business school to allow more transactional studies. But there's a part of Harvard, led by the president, Drew Faust, that says, at least as an undergraduate, for your 4 years there, you're supposed to marvel at art. You're supposed to travel to India. You're supposed to not be transactional in your education, but transformative in your education. It's supposed to shape who you are as a human. And it's not there to say, I'm doing this course because I am going to, learn the C++ coding and thus use it for a transactional way. And that's a tension that's interesting. I tend to be a little bit more on the side of we don't need to become more transactional. We should allow colleges to nurture creativity in all of its forms, in beauty, in the arts, and not say this is something practical you're going to learn that you're going to put forth in your profession, but just say maybe Sanskrit poetry will turn you on. maybe the history of religions, as well as the history of science, as well as, organisms and biology you should learn about. But you should learn about it for the pure joy of learning. And to me, that nurtures curiosity, and curiosity is a prerequisite for creativity. Secondly, I think learning should be more collaborative. When I was in college, they called that cheating, but it means working in teams. So that you can explore together things, usually across silos. Like I noticed that the Kumbh Mela, which Steve Jobs went to in India, which I don't know, you probably know, every 20 years or something, one of the grand festivals. Harvard just encouraged whole bunches of students to go there, those studying technology, religion, public health, everything else, and to work as a team when something like that happened. So I don't think there's a recipe, but just like when I said at the very beginning, there's no recipe to innovation where you can say, here's the 7 things you need to learn. Don't worry about learning about people. No, you should actually kind of marvel at Grace Hopper and Bob Noyce and Steve Jobs and say, I'm not just learning 7 transactional lessons, I'm learning about real people, and from them I will get inspired.
Your name and a little bit about yourself.
Hello, so my name is Kairos. I'm very happy that I'm actually asking you a question after reading your book. A little bit about myself, I just changed my name. Kairos means the right time, the timing of opportunity, and I changed it because it sounds like my former name, which was Carlos, and also sounds like curious, so I like that. I once attended a talk by Chris Hughes from the original founders of Facebook, and his talk was the myth of the lonely, all-alone genius. He said it was a complete myth, that it was a very easy explanation to a complicated string of events.
Right.
And so I would like to get your thoughts and your take, not on a personal story of success or a visible leader, but on a culture of innovation. Over the summer, I went to Israel, which is a very small nation, but also has very remarkable innovation milestones, like flash drives and, I don't know, startup nation, a lot of companies in Nasdaq are Israeli, even though...
Instant messengers, yeah.
Yeah. The thing that I noticed there was about the culture. Like, I've been living here in Canada for the last 2 years. I've attended meetups for 10, 15 times. It was the 5th meetup on the Internet of Things group in Tel Aviv, and they were already pooling their money and setting up a contest to see the next startup.
Let me get back to Chris Hughes and tie the dots together, because Chris is right. I mean, that's the whole point of this book, which is that innovation is not a loner's sport where somebody in a garret is a romantic lone inventor. That's Atanasov, whose computer never worked. So you have to be collaborative, and you have to form the right teams. Zuckerberg was pretty good at it. He kept Chris Hughes, but but you find cultures that know how to work together. I think that, you may say in Tel Aviv you have that culture. I can see it in many places. But it is, if you're creating MaRS here, it is what your main goal should be, which is make it like the homebrew computer club where everybody's sharing diagrams and stuff. They may want to go off on their own with their intellectual property and monetize it at some point, but they're willing to come together and share ideas.
Just one little compliment.
Here, so we can go here. Next
Well,
question.
we got so many questions.
We do. We have a lot.
Thanks a lot, Walter. So my name is Nitesh Peters. I'm a student entrepreneur, and I do a lot of policy work. So my question is more of a philosophical one. So I really appreciate your emphasis on the creative process and these individuals that develop these technologies. But to what extent do you think, so what I see, I spent a year in West Africa last year working on developing issues. So to what extent do you think technology has become a mechanism that drives itself, to the extent to which, don't you think technology is an instrument for greater social problems, right? So, I mean, I know lots of people in the Valley.
I'm sorry, for what social problems?
To solve social problems, so to make the world a better place, right? So I know a lot of people in the Valley, in Toronto, in the startup community, and it's almost as if technology as a cycle drives itself rather than starting with the problem, right? Starting with global problems, and then viewing technology as an instrument. And so philosophically, I feel like your book plays a premium.
It's called the teleological question, which is whether technology has its own personality, whether the printing press automatically pushes you to creation of novels or the Reformation or the Renaissance or whatever. I tend to be on the side that doesn't put a lot of stock on technology having its own, What Technology Wants is a good book by a friend of mine, but I'm not absolutely sure technology wants something. I think it is a tool.
It is a tool.
Yeah, and it is a tool that we get to use. I sometimes think that we want, to create a startup that will go public in 3 years or it'll be bought out in 2 years and make $1 million or $1 billion. So therefore, we create technologies that are not as socially useful as they could be, but are geared to being startups that get to an IPO quickly. So I don't know that we can blame the technology. As Shakespeare would tell us, the fault is in ourselves if that's happening. I tend to think that the profit motive is actually a good spur to allowing Intel to create a microchip, if you know what I mean, and probably a drug company to finally figuring out how to sequence the Ebola virus. So I'm not trying to take the profit motive out, but I'm trying to say you want to create something of value. And there's two ways to defining value. One is a market short-term value, and one is a value to society over a longer term. At the very end of Steve Jobs' life, when he was pretty sick, I remember asking him a question like this, which is, what's the meaning of all this technology we're creating? And he said, life is like a river. If you're lucky, you get to take things out of the river that people before you have invented and put in it. Ideas they've invented, processes, gadgets, whatever. But when you get to a certain point, you realize that the meaning of life is not how much you get to take out of the river, but what you put back into the river. What will be meaningful a generation later. And so that's the type of value I think we have to keep our eye on as we figure out what are we putting back into the river.
Thank you.
Brief questions, please.
Hi, Walter.
Yeah, I'll be brief for answers, too, but I take the hint.
Thanks for your time. My name's George. I work as an analyst at the local bank. So I'm curious at your thought on financial services industry, particularly the trend that graduates from top MBA programs are choosing the Silicon Valley over Wall Street. It's a fairly recent trend.
Well,
so
I'm going to say something you probably don't love, which is I think the misallocation of IQ points into the financial industry was not a great thing. That for decades, the smartest people, the guy who ran Intel told me the great thing about the financial crash was for the first time I could go to Yale or Harvard or Toronto or wherever and get math majors who might actually want to join Intel instead of creating an algorithm for a hedge fund or something or working for banks.
Right.
I think that obviously the financial industry does a good thing, but the question is, where should we be allocating our IQ points? Secondly, I think that the financial industry should be headed for, and I hope you'll be in the vanguard of, a major disruption, meaning Bitcoins and other types of things should allow us to take more control over our transactions than have them be as kludgy as they are for the average citizen who wants to send money, make a small purchase online, or whatever it may be. So I would hope that as people go into the financial industry, they would say, let me do this. I mean, sometimes I'll find somebody who's a great math whiz coming out of college and say, I'm going to go work for, I won't name, a hedge fund. So what are you going to do? Oh, I've got an algorithm that'll shave a millisecond off of a nanosecond off of this, that, and the other. I say, why are you doing that? So, because we can make money if we... I said, yeah, but why are you doing it? He says, oh, because you can, by the spread, make a profit and you can really... I said, yeah, but why are you doing it? And I think, people in any industry, whether it's going into the pharmaceuticals or Intel or financial, say, okay, why am I doing it? And there are ways I think we can make through, easing the friction on transactions, micro-lending, everything else, make the world better for everybody. Or we can apply our mathematical genius to, a type of algorithm that might make money for a hedge fund but not serve the world as much. But I know I'm unpopular saying that, especially probably amongst the people you work for.
Yes.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Your name?
Well, I hope it wasn't insulting, was it?
No,
Okay.
not at all.
Thank you.
Your name,
yes,
please.
finally.
Say a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Sorry. My name is Amin, and I'm, for the purposes of my question, a mechanical engineer with an MBA who's worked in oil and gas, aerospace, data analytics, and now hoping to bridge into renewable energy. The fact that I'm a woman is incidental to all of those qualifications. So my question to you kind of spurs from the earlier comments made where women should be the first people to speak or the first to interrupt. The fact that I'm a woman is only ever pointed out to me by the other 50% of the population and not myself. The only time I've been cognizant that I'm the only woman in a room full of guys is, in fact, when a guy has mentioned it to me. Until that moment, I am in a room full of my peers. So my question to you is, what do we do to educate the other 50% of the people about how their conduct impacts the uncomfortable situation or segregates my accomplishments from everybody else's just by virtue of the fact that I happen to be a woman?
Yeah, I'll answer that, but first let me praise what you've been doing in terms of technology, which we often talk about as information technology. But technology in the energy sphere, whether it's unconventional sources of gas or whether it's renewable sources of energy, that's a technology field I should have given a shout out to, along with healthcare technology as being a wave of the future and being more difficult to do than the Facebook in the dorm room. I mean, maybe you can do it, but it tends to take, fracking takes thousands of innovations done, over a course of time. I don't, and I said all that because I'm not sure I know the answer to your question. There's a bit of a tension, which is I would like men to not be less cognizant of the role of women, but more cognizant in a way. I would like any man who works at a company in which 90%, are men, to at least ask a question of, are they creating an environment that is not as inclusive? I feel even as strongly about people, from different backgrounds, people from poorer backgrounds, that this whole technology and innovation space leaves out a lot of the population. So even though I would like maybe to say to men, just ignore the fact of who's a woman and who's a man in the room, there's also a part of me that says, if there's only one woman around the table, is there anything you've done to make an atmosphere in which there aren't more women, more people of color, more people from poor backgrounds, more whatever around the table? So even though it's uncomfortable, I don't mind people being cognizant of diversity issues.
I'm going to double down on this side.
All right.
And go to this
And I'm
next
really
speaker.
promise to make shorter answers. I'm
Right.
sorry.
I was going to say, this is the women's mic.
I just want to say
We're keeping it.
there's less than 10 minutes left.
Too short.
So we have to have brief questions, and I really want to take questions from everybody who's taken the opportunity to stand. So please be brief, and
Okay.
let's try and get through everyone.
Heather Crosby. I'm a mentor to entrepreneurs at Venture Lab, which is like MaRS, but north of Toronto, another innovation center. There are two nonprofit organizations, one in the US and Canada, that do work with girls and women to learn how to code. One in the US called Girls Who Code, and one in Canada called Ladies Learning Code. So just when you are talking to this, there is certainly a number of initiatives that are going forward in trying to ensure more women move into computer science. My question, I had many questions, but I only get one, and they were all about prognosticating, talking about the implications going forward of everything you've experienced and learned and the interactions you've had with great minds. So my only question is there anyone or any publications that you would recommend to a non-technical, non-engineering person that I could follow, that you follow, that would incite thinking and questioning and knowledge for me going forward. There are so many issues related to the internet and for example.
It's a good, I must say, I surf all over the place on the web. I read the conventional newspapers, but there's 100 places I'll go online for the latest in both technology and the moral issues surrounding our technology. So I don't have sort of a great reading list, but I do read history a lot. I think that matters as well.
My name is Jimo Viagale. I'm a software engineer at Nascent Digital and co-founder of ROS. We're building an artificially intelligent research solution powered by IBM's Watson. My question is, Leonardo da Vinci was working on flight in the 15th century, trying to imitate something that was unique to birds. And it wasn't achieved till the 20th century with the Wright brothers. Don't you think, since intelligence is more complicated than flight, that we're being a little impatient with it?
Yeah, I think it's possible in 500 years, to go back to Leonardo, that we will have a machine that truly passes the Turing test. But you work with Watson, and when you get to the end of the book, Watson is one of the stars. And Jenny Ramati, who's the CEO of IBM, says, the more we work with Watson, and the more we work with Deep Blue, the chess-playing machine, the more we realize that combining Watson with doctors, for example, as opposed to trying to get Watson to diagnose cancer alone, or combining Deep Blue with people who played chess, that you could combine a computer chess program with an amateur chess player, and the combination of a human computer would beat any grandmaster or Deep Blue. So she said that she learned that the era of cognitive computing, which is what Watson is all about, will advance much more rapidly to the extent we pair the two. It is possible you'll get to artificial intelligence that does not require any humans, as you put it, in 500 years. I don't know why that should be a goal. I don't know that that would get us further than the continued combination of the two. J.C.R. Licklider, who's one of the heroes of the book, was asked that question in the 50s by all the people who then said artificial intelligence will just be 20, 30 years away. And he said, maybe so. Maybe it'll come in 20 years, maybe in 200 years, maybe in 2 millennium. But in the meantime, why don't we combine the power of human creativity and the processing power of machines and do the awesome things we can do with that approach? So to me, that's the way of happening. And you should remember that as great as Leonardo was, when we did flying machines, they weren't flapping the wings, replicating a bird. It was something totally different. So maybe our machines shouldn't replicate animals. Maybe we should have them do different things.
Your name, please.
My name is Hélène Julian, and I'm the founder of a a startup that's preparing to launch called EnviroCommons. And it's an online interactive national platform for creating collective power for us to work together to create change in the areas of climate change, sustainability, and environment issues. And I built this by myself. So I'm a programmer for years. And it took me 6 years. And so, I don't want to discourage anybody from doing what I did, because sometimes you do have to do it by yourself. I couldn't find anybody who had, sort of mindset that I had. And, but now I'm at the stage where I have advisors. I've got a guy who's an investor, who was for many years a senior
we only have another minute
senior
or two,
companies.
so maybe
Can I ask what your question might be?
Okay.
Because we only have 4 minutes on the clock.
Oh, okay, sorry. Have you invested in any of the companies that you had like connections with, like Apple? You were there at the start of like a lot of stuff going on. You never invested?
Generally invest in companies that I would write about. I feel that that would be a conflict, and all of my investments are in the S&P 500, which is really boring.
Yeah.
Sorry.
2 more questions. Yes.
So I'll skip the intro. My name is Sandeep. Quick questions, sort of contrarian. So what's your point of view on this whole fetishization of the startup culture, right? So pretty much everyone today talks about wanting
I'm sorry,
to do
the what-ification?
sort of the whole fetish around the startup culture, which has become this cool and hip thing.
Yeah.
I think Paul Graham from Y Combinator called it the makeup startup culture. So because there is obviously a lot of people are going to get burned, and maybe it's not. So there's this whole
Is there too much focus on startups? That's
and lack of appreciation of doing it.
Yeah, I think there may be a little bit too much focus on startups because one of the most important things is to figure out what works and bring it to scale. And so I do think that the bring it to scale culture is something that we should work on more. But I don't want to discourage any startups because they're pretty cool. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Laura Mitchell.
I'm sorry about the short answers, but I'm trying to get everybody
that's okay.
in.
Appreciate that. Thanks.
I have a short one as well. My name is Laura Mitchell. My husband and I are working on a startup, and it's a diversity game. That's all I can tell you. So here's my question, short and sweet. Everybody keeps talking constantly. We hear it in the States, we hear it in Canada, all over Europe, et cetera, that there should be changes to the educational system to get us on this track toward entrepreneurial work. So what changes should be happening? Because we as recently graduated or even a long time ago graduated students know that, but they're not happening. So what do you advocate?
Well,
And
I think
you.
that the K through 12, the kindergarten through 12th grade education system in Canada and the United States used to be the best in the world. Now in the United States it's about 18th, which is really bad. Secondly, I think we in the United States more than Canada have a two-tiered education system, which is if you're from a privileged family, you get a good education, not if you're not. So I think that's particularly bad. I think that we need to continue to encourage questioning of authority, curiosity, creativity. That has been the secret sauce, as I said, since the birth of the United States. And I do think we do an okay job with that in our, and then at the university level, I think more collaborative and cross-platform. So the biologist is working with the data miner, and instead of saying there's a biology department and a computer science department, they're in different buildings.
30 seconds for your question.
We can go a minute long. I'll be all right.
I'm curious about you, Walter, because I'm a huge fan, and you're by far my favorite author. I'm curious about what do you do personally to stay creative, and what are some of your most memorable books that you've read?
Yeah, I mean, I have failed a lot, and I'm okay with failure. I was not particularly good at running CNN, as you may have noticed. I don't think you put that in my resume even, so maybe I've whitewashed it out. But I try to say, all right, I'm the luckiest camper around. I live in a great time, in a great place, and I don't try to have a chip on my shoulder and try to protect everything. I try to say, all right, let me take a risk. I mean, even in a small way, this book was a bit of a risk, which was I could have done another conventional biography, and it would have been, huge. But doing a collaborative thing was a way to say, let me try something different. So I try to keep moving. That helps.
Last question.
Really short and sweet question. It's actually the question from Peter's side. What's the one thing that you believe in that most people don't?
One thing I believe in that most people don't, Peter Thiel asked that question. I strongly believe, and most people don't, but not all, I strongly believe that throughout human history, our moral capabilities have kept up with our technology, with a few bad mistakes, like the atom bomb. We dropped it before we processed it morally. I believe that all the data points show that technology doesn't put people out of work. It opens more opportunities. I believe that technology doesn't get out of our control, and that's why we need the humanities, so that we're able to process and understand and put in historic context and moral context this notion of what our technology can and should do. Because it doesn't control us, we control it. So when people talk about that this technology might put people out of work, or it's causing offshoring or robotics is bad for the car industry or whatever. I say, no, as humans, we've always been able to process and handle our technology, and we will be able to do that in the future as long as we feel comfortable with our technology and don't fear it, as long as we know where it came from, which is why I write books like this, and as long as we're able to ask the moral questions that arise on everything from privacy to genetic engineering that arise every time we have a march of technology. And so I think that the fear and the pessimism and the almost Ludditism against new technologies that happens almost every time a new technology comes along, I'm always on the Pollyannish, optimistic side, but I think I got history on my side, if not most of the people. Thank you, Earl.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, everyone in the audience, and particularly to the questioners who helped us continue this conversation. I think you'd all agree that this was a very rich and interesting discussion tonight, and I want you once again to join me in thanking Walter Isaacson.
Thank you, Earl.